You know, when you look back at a total national collapse, I mean, an utter civilization-level catastrophe, the historical record usually reads, well, kind of like an autopsy report.
Right, yeah, it's incredibly clinical usually.
Exactly. It documents the failure, pointing out, the ruptured borders, the burned cities, the exiled citizens, and it essentially just gestures to the rubble and says, here is exactly where and how it all died.
It's a post-mortem. I mean, human history is completely full of them.
Yeah.
You categorize the trauma, you assign the blame, and then you just close the book. The narrative becomes, well, entirely about the finality of the destruction.
Right. It's finalized. It is over. But then, you step into the world of ancient Judahite history, specifically the period following their devastating exile to Babylon. And suddenly that standard autopsy report is just thrown completely out the window.
Oh, absolutely.
We are looking at a historical landscape that isn't about dissecting a corpse at all. It is entirely about figuring out how to, reanimate one.
Yeah. It is the absolute definition of a survival manual, honestly, but one that is cleverly disguised as an ancient history.
And that is exactly what we are exploring today on this deep dive. In my hands, I have a brilliantly detailed, comprehensive survey of the biblical book of 1 Chronicles put together by Chris R. Velasquez.
It's a fantastic survey.
It really is. Now, I know what you might be thinking. If you, the listener, have ever tried to actually sit down and read 1 Chronicles, there is a very good chance you hit a massive wall.
Most people do, yeah.
Right. It has a reputation for being this incredibly dusty, impenetrable ancient text filled with, endless unpronounceable names and obscure tribal battles.
Just pages and pages of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's the real hook. According to this survey, what we are actually looking at is a masterclass in crisis management, identity reconstruction, and finding tangible hope after your entire world has literally burned to the ground.
And the way Velasquez frames this is crucial, I think. If you approach 1 Chronicles just looking for, a simple timeline of events, you are going to completely miss the genius of the architecture.
Right.
It is an architectural blueprint for a shattered society trying to rebuild itself from absolute ground zero.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we don't understand the context, literally none of this is going to make sense. We need to set the historical stage.
Yeah, let's do that.
Paint the picture for us. Where exactly are we in history, and who is this actually written for?
Well, let's roll the clock back and look at the trauma first. So, in the year 586 BCE, the Babylonian Empire, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, completely decimated Jerusalem.
And we shouldn't gloss over what that actually looked like.
No, not at all. This wasn't just a change in political administration or new taxes. The city walls were breached after a horrific, starving siege.
Wow.
The magnificent temple built by Solomon, which was the literal center of their universe, where they believed the presence of God actually dwelled, that was looted and burned to the ground.
Just completely gone.
Completely. The Davidic king was blinded and dragged away in chains, and the absolute brightest and best of the population were deported hundreds of miles away to Babylon. It was an existential erasure.
It's the kind of trauma that usually just erases a culture from the map forever. You just become, a footnote in someone else's empire.
Exactly what usually happens. But miraculously, they actually survived the exile. Decades later, the geopolitical tectonic plates shift, right? The Persian Empire conquers Babylon.
A new sheriff in town.
Exactly. And the Persian king, Cyrus, issues a decree, allowing the exiled peoples to return to their homelands. So we fast forward to the late Persian period, most likely the 4th century BCE.
Okay, so this is way after the destruction.
Right. And the traditional Jewish view has always attributed the writing of 1 Chronicles to Ezra the scribe, but the dominant scholarly consensus, which Velasquez highlights in the survey, is that it's actually anonymous. Yeah. It was likely produced by a post-exilic chronicler, or maybe a circle of highly educated priestly and Levitical scribes living back in Jerusalem.
So these are the descendants of the people who were exiled. They have finally come back home.
They are back. But let's put ourselves in their shoes for a second. The reality of the return was deeply disappointing.
It wasn't the glorious homecoming they imagined.
Not even close. Yes, they are back in the physical geography of Jerusalem, but they have completely lost their sovereignty. Their idealized, pre-exilic world of great kings and grand independence is just a ghost.
Right.
They are living under the strict, watchful constraint of the Persian Empire. They managed to rebuild a modest second temple, but the older folks who actually remembered Solomon's glorious temple, they literally wept because the new one was so underwhelming in comparison.
That was so sad, honestly.
It is. They are a small, highly vulnerable, impoverished community trying to figure out a terrifying question. Who are we now that the crown is gone, the glory is gone, and we are just subjects of a foreign emperor?
They are suffering from a massive society-wide identity crisis.
Exactly.
They are holding the shattered pieces of their history and trying to glue them back together. And the thesis of this survey points out that to solve this crisis, the author, the chronicler, does something very specific. Old Chronicles is not just a lazy copy-paste job of the older historical books they already had, like 2 Samuel or 1 and 2 Kings, right?
Right. They aren't just repeating the past.
So what are they doing?
What's fascinating here is the methodology the chronicler uses. Scholars call it theological historiography.
Theological historiography.
Yeah. It is a highly deliberate, meticulously selective reshaping of Israel's memory. The chronicler isn't just, archiving facts. They are curating a narrative designed to tell a deeply wounded, insecure community that their future survival doesn't lie in attempting some doomed military rebellion against Persia.
Right, which would be suicide.
Exactly. Nor does it lie in miserable nostalgia for the good old days. Their survival lies in faithful, ordered worship and...
I like that.
In Hebrew, the traditional name for the book is Divrei Hayamim, which translates literally to the words of the days, or the events of the days. But a much better way to understand it is history as remembered interpretation.
So if you are the chronicler and you are trying to rebuild a shattered community, you first have to figure out who actually belongs to it, right? Who survived the fire?
Yes, step 1.
And that naturally leads us to the very beginning of the book. The first 9 chapters of First Chronicles are, well, they're notorious. They're just genealogies.
Famous lists.
Massive, sprawling lists of names, tracing humanity all the way from the first human Adam, down through centuries of history, all the way to the returned post-exilic settlers living in Jerusalem.
Quite the undertaking.
Yeah. And the survey notes that these lists aren't equal. They heavily prioritize 2 specific tribes, Judah, which is the royal line of David, and Levi, which is the priestly line.
And that disproportionate focus is incredibly telling. Judah and Levi get the massive spotlight because the book's entire theological center of gravity revolves around 2 poles, the Davidic kingship and the temple worship.
Okay, that makes sense.
The chronicler is establishing the 2 pillars that will actually hold up this new society.
Okay, but I have to push back on this for a second.
Sure.
Let's think about this from a literary and psychological standpoint. If you are a writer and your goal is to inspire a broken, traumatized, depressed people, why in the world would you start your gripping, vital, life-saving history with a giant spreadsheet of names?
It does seem counterintuitive.
Right. I mean, reading those first 9 chapters feels like trying to read a phone book from a city you don't even live in.
Yeah.
It is objectively monotonous.
Very true for a modern reader.
But, as I was reading the source material, I tried to imagine it from the perspective of an exile. Maybe to this community, it wasn't a phone book at all. Maybe it was more like recovering the lost DNA sequence of their society after a devastating radioactive event.
Oh, I love that. Building on that analogy, a DNA sequence is exactly what this is. You have to understand the sociological reality of the ancient Near East.
Okay.
We read these names through a modern, highly individualized Western lens, where a name is just a label, right?
Yeah, just what your parents called you.
Exactly. But this was a deeply kinship-oriented honor-shame society.
Yeah.
In a world like that, genealogies are not filler material. They are what scholars call social theology. They are your identity maps. They are your promissory maps.
So they actually functioned as legal and social proof. They prove who you are and what you have a right to claim in a society that is literally rebuilding from scratch.
That is the core of it. Imagine coming back to a ruined Jerusalem after 70 years away. How do you prove which plot of land belongs to your family?
Wow. Yeah, you wouldn't have a deed.
Exactly. How do you prove your marital legitimacy? How do you prove your right to hold a civic office? Or most importantly, your right to serve as a priest in the newly rebuilt temple?
You don't have a modern government database.
No, you have genealogies. That's your database. Furthermore, these lists brilliantly summarize the entire Old Testament storyline just by naming the key characters and families in order.
It's like a really compressed summary.
Yes. They establish a profound psychological comfort. They tell this small, struggling, seemingly insignificant post-exilic group that they are not a historical accident.
Right.
They are the direct, unbroken continuation of God's universal plan that started on page 1 of Genesis with Adam.
It's irrefutable proof of belonging. It grounds them. It says, the empire didn't erase you. You are still here, and your bloodline carries the promise.
And it also establishes necessary boundaries and structure. The Levitical lists, for instance, are incredibly detailed because they prove exactly who is authorized to manage the dangerous holy space of the temple.
Right, you don't just want anyone wandering in there.
Absolutely not. In a traumatized society that desperately needs boundaries, legitimacy, and a sense of order, these lists provide a bedrock foundation. They say to the reader, you belong here, and here's exactly how our community is ordered.
And what I absolutely love about this section is that right in the middle of this massive sweeping DNA sequence, where you are just reading name after name after name, there's this tiny, intensely personal, almost jarring moment.
The prayer of Jabez.
Yes. In 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, the list of Judah's clan suddenly pauses to focus on a guy named Jabez. It says, Jabez was more honored than his brothers, and his mother called his name Jabez, saying, because I bore him in pain.
Such a striking detail to include.
It really is. And then it records this brief, desperate prayer where he asks God to bless him, to enlarge his border, to keep his hand with him, and to keep him from harm so that it might not bring him pain. And the text simply concludes, and God granted what he asked.
It's beautiful.
It is, but why interrupt this grand, sweeping, macro-level history for this one little prayer from a guy named Paine?
Well, it is a brilliant literary and theological move by the chronicler. The overarching story of these 9 chapters is massive, right? It's about nations, tribes, millennia history, and massive corporate covenant promises.
It's huge.
It can feel like the individual doesn't matter at all in the face of all that history. But by inserting Jabez, the chronicler proves that personal faithfulness and individual divine blessing are still entirely possible inside that grand covenant story.
It breaks the determinism. Just because your mother named you Pain, which might have reflected the trauma of the era he was born into, that doesn't mean your destiny is locked into suffering.
Exactly. This raises an important question for the original reader. Does God still hear me?
Me personally.
Right. The inclusion of Jabez tells the post-exilic reader, yes, you are part of a giant corporate entity, and yes, you are living in the shadow of historical trauma, but God still hears the individual who cries out to him. It completely humanizes the spreadsheet.
That is so deeply encouraging. So once the community has mapped out this DNA sequence, once they know who they are and that they belong, the next critical existential question for any society trying to rebuild is, who leads them?
The leadership question is unavoidable.
Right, because clearly the leadership models of the past led them straight into the Babylonian exile.
Yeah, it didn't work out so well.
No. And the narrative in 1 Chronicles abruptly shifts gears from these 9 chapters of lists into a very dramatic, violent transfer of power. We move into the narrative section starting in chapter 10.
And the chronicler does something highly selective here that often confuses first-time readers.
What's them?
If you compare this to the older histories, the chronicler skips over almost all of Israel's early history. There is no story of the Exodus from Egypt, no wandering in the wilderness, no era of the judges.
They just fast forward.
The narrative zeroes in with laser precision on the exact moment of the death of Saul, Israel's very first king, and the subsequent rise of David.
The story starts on the battlefield of Mount Gilboa. Saul is defeated by the Philistines and he takes his own life. But the chronicler doesn't just record the military defeat, right? The text interprets the theology behind the death.
Yes, that's the key.
The survey highlights the First Chronicles makes it explicitly clear Saul dies because he was unfaithful and failed to seek YHWH. The text uses the Hebrew word darash, meaning to seek, to inquire, or to consult.
Right, darash.
Saul didn't darash God. In fact, earlier traditions show him seeking out a medium at Endor instead.
Chapter 10 functions as a theological lens for the entire rest of the book. It interprets Saul's death not as, bad military luck or poor tactics, but as direct divine judgment for covenant infidelity.
So help me understand the implications of this for leadership. If we look back at the older texts in Samuel, Saul was exactly what people thought a king should be.
Oh, he looked apart.
Right, he had the look, he was head taller than anyone else, he had the undeniable charisma, he looked like royalty straight out of central casting. Why did he fail so spectacularly, and why is the chronicler reminding the exiles of this failure?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture of what the post-exilic community is facing, Chronicles uses Saul as the ultimate negative foil. He is the archetype of what not to do.
A cautionary tale.
Exactly. The central lesson the chronicler is driving home to a community trying to rebuild is that leadership, no matter how charismatic, how naturally gifted, or how physically imposing, it collapses entirely without obedience.
Wow.
Saul treated God as an afterthought, a tool to be used when convenient. The chronicler is insisting that spiritual and civic authority is not based on physical stature or brute force. Its sole foundation is covenant fidelity.
And David is presented as the total contrast to this.
Precisely. And notice how the chronicler portrays David's rise. In the older books, like Samuel, David's rise to power is incredibly bloody, filled with civil war, political maneuvering, and assassinations between David's men and Saul's surviving family.
It's very Game of Thrones.
Very much so. But the chronicler condenses all of that. He portrays David being consolidated as king not by manipulating his way to the top, but by clear divine providence and the immediate, unanimous support of the people.
It's a much cleaner transition.
Yes. Chapter 11 and 12 detail warriors from literally every single tribe rallying to David at Hebron to turn the kingdom over to him.
It's a picture of total national unity. All Israel gathers. And for you listening, think about how aggressively relevant that is today.
Oh, it really is.
In our modern society, whether we are talking about politics, corporate business, or even cultural and religious movements, we are absolutely obsessed with charisma. We elevate leaders who have the look, the charm, the dominant force of personality.
And we excuse a lot if they produce results.
Exactly. We excuse massive character flaws if the person gets things done. But this ancient text is screaming across the millennia, insisting that true civic and spiritual authority requires humility and an active seeking, a darash of a higher moral order. Talent without faithful accountability is just a recipe for a Saul-like collapse.
It's a profound warning. Power in the biblical worldview is never autonomous. It is always derivative and accountable to God.
So David gets the throne. He has the unified support of the tribes. But the text immediately makes it clear that leadership in Israel isn't just about managing people, running an economy, or winning battles. In 1 Chronicles, true leadership is ultimately about managing God's actual presence.
Yes, the presence is paramount.
And this brings us to chapters 13 through 16, which focus entirely on the story of the Ark of the Covenant.
The Ark of the Covenant is the physical manifestation of God's localized presence among his people. It is a wooden chest overlaid with gold, topped with 2 cherubim, containing the tablets of the law.
It's the most sacred object they have.
Without a doubt. And David, who is deeply enthusiastic about his new kingship and his newly captured capital city of Jerusalem, he wants to bring the Ark right into the center of the city.
It makes sense politically and spiritually.
It does. It's a move to centralize both political and religious power.
And he tries. He gathers tens of thousands of people, they build a brand new cart to carry it, they put the ark on the cart, and they are playing music, dancing, celebrating.
It's a huge parade.
But they do it improperly. They don't follow the ancient instructions. And it results in a sudden, shocking, and deeply unsettling tragedy.
It's a terrifying moment in the text.
As the procession is moving, the oxen stumble. A man named Uzzah, who is driving the cart, simply reaches out his hand to steady the ark so it doesn't fall in the dirt. And the moment he touches it, he is struck dead by God on the spot.
It is an incredibly jarring narrative moment. You have all this unity, all this pure celebration, and then suddenly lethal divine judgment. David is terrified and angry, and he halts the entire procession.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I was trying to wrap my head around why God would kill a guy who is just trying to help.
Yeah, it's a common struggle for modern readers.
And I look at David's first attempt like someone who has bought a massive 10,000-volt industrial appliance, and they bring it home and try to plug it directly into a standard 110-volt wall outlet in their living room, completely bypassing the required industrial transformer.
That's a great way to put it.
The enthusiasm was absolutely there. They genuinely wanted the power in the room, but the protocol for handling something that dangerously powerful was completely ignored, and the entire system just blew up.
That analogy captures the mechanics of the event perfectly. What Uzzah encountered was the unmitigated reality of God's holiness.
The holiness.
Yes, the Hebrew word is kadosh. And we often misunderstand holiness today as just meaning like moral purity or being really good.
Yeah, behaving nicely.
Exactly. But in the ancient Near Eastern context, kadosh is about a weighty, dangerous, almost radioactive state of perfection and otherness. It is not negotiable. God's presence is a life-giving force. But if approached casually or improperly, It is lethal.
You can't just wing it when you're dealing with the creator of the universe. You can't put the ark on a Philistine-style ox cart just because it's more efficient.
Let's add some historical texture to that, actually. The Philistines had previously moved the ark on a cart, but they were outside the covenant. They didn't know the law.
Right, they had an excuse.
Exactly. David should have known better. Worship isn't a space for casual human innovation or relying purely on good intentions. It is supposed to be an obedient response to divine revelation.
Zeal without order is dangerously arrogant.
Very much so. So David has to retreat and regroup. He realizes his catastrophic error. And in chapter 15, he corrects his mistake.
He goes back to the instruction manual.
Yes, he realizes that the transformer required to handle the voltage of God's presence is the Levitical priesthood.
Circling back to the genealogies.
Exactly. The Torah explicitly commanded that the ark must be carried on poles, resting on the shoulders of consecrated Levites, the very personnel we saw meticulously outlined in those early DNA genealogies.
It all connects.
It does. David organizes them, they undergo proper ritual sanctification, and they carry the ark into Jerusalem exactly as prescribed, accompanied by highly organized, joyful, authorized music.
And the second time, it worked perfectly. The ark safely enters Jerusalem, and they throw a massive, ecstatic celebration. The survey highlights the Thanksgiving psalm that David appoints for this moment in chapter 16.
A very important psalm.
It is this beautiful, woven piece of liturgy celebrating YHWH's reign over all the earth. And the survey points out that this psalm introduces a crucial theological concept for the rest of the book, hesed.
Hesed is arguably one of the most beautiful and conceptually dense words in the Hebrew Bible.
It's hard to translate, isn't it?
It is notoriously difficult to translate into a single English word. It means steadfast love, loyal love, loving kindness, or covenant faithfulness. It is the defining bedrock characteristic of God's nature.
It's a loyalty that refuses to let go.
Yes. And by placing this psalm here, the chronicler is anchoring the post-exilic community's hope, not in their own military strength, which they don't have anyway, but in God's hesed.
Right.
The liturgy in chapter 16 teaches the returning exiles that their worship isn't just a performance to appease an angry deity. It is the public communal remembrance of God's loyal love, which is the only thing that actually guarantees their future survival.
So God's presence is safely resting in Jerusalem inside a tent. The kingdom is totally united. David is feeling established and successful, and naturally he looks around and thinks, I live in a beautiful palace made of imported cedar, but the Ark of God is still sitting out there in a tent.
It bothers him.
Yeah, he says, I should build God a permanent, magnificent temple. And this ambition brings us to chapter 17, which our source material explicitly identifies as the absolute theological center of gravity for the entire book of 1 Chronicles.
It is the hinge upon which the entire theology of the chronicler turns.
Okay, let's dig into that.
David has a seemingly noble desire. He wants to build a physical structure to house God. But God sends the prophet Nathan to intercept David, and God flips the script entirely. The narrative moves decisively away from a physical building project and establishes an eternal, unconditional promise.
God essentially says through the prophet, no, David, you are not going to build me a house. I am going to build you a house. Why is this specific exchange considered the theological epicenter of everything the chronicler is trying to say to these exiles?
Well, this raises a fascinating tension between human ambition and divine grace. The chronicler is utilizing a profound and brilliant wordplay on the Hebrew word beit, which simply means house.
Okay, break the mechanics of that wordplay down for us.
When David uses the word beit, he means a temple, a physical structure of cedar, stone, and gold. He wants to secure God's legacy and his own legacy through a monumental human achievement.
A building project.
Right. But God takes that word, beit, and completely redefines it. God uses beit to mean a dynasty, a lasting, unbroken royal lineage. God says, you won't build me a beit, a physical temple, but I will build you a beit, an eternal royal dynasty.
It's a complete reversal of patronage. David thinks he is the patron doing God a favor, and God reminds him who the actual sovereign is.
Exactly. The chronicler is emphasizing to his deeply insecure post-exilic readers that the kingdom of God does not rest on human initiative, military might, or architectural projects. It rests entirely on God's grace and his unilateral covenant promise.
So it's not about what they can build for God.
No. Human plans for God must always yield to God's plan for human history.
But wait, help me understand the psychology of the audience here. If I am a returned exile reading this in the 4th century BCE under the thumb of the Persian Empire,
Yeah, put yourself there.
there is no king on the throne in Jerusalem. The line of David was physically broken and dragged off to Babylon centuries ago. So when the chronicler highlights this promise of an eternal dynasty, how does that not just sound like a cruel joke or evidence that God's promise actually failed?
That is the ultimate tension, and it reveals the sheer audacity of the chronicler's faith.
It's bold.
It is incredibly bold. By centering this eternal, unconditional promise in a time when the physical throne is undeniably empty, the chronicler is insisting that the promise has not been voided by the exile.
The promise still stands.
Yes, the physical throne might be vacant, but the covenant remains open to the eschatological future. They're taking this historical promise and turning it into a forward-looking, prophetic expectation.
They are saying the promise is permanent, therefore a king must be coming.
Yes, this creates a theological trajectory that directly fuels the messianic hope of the Second Temple period. The Christological connection here is immense.
Oh, absolutely.
This matrix of expectation, a true king whose throne is established forever, who represents God's rule on earth, is exactly what the New Testament writers tap into. It is why the Gospel of Matthew opens its very first verse by deliberately introducing Jesus of Nazareth as the Son of David.
Tying right back to 1 Chronicles 17.
Yes. The chronicler was writing a theological placeholder for the Messiah.
So the readers in the Persian period are being told to hold on. The Bayit, the house of David, is guaranteed by God himself, even if they can't see the king yet.
Precisely.
Now, David receives this incredible eternal promise. He is the chosen one. But what I appreciate about this history is that it doesn't portray David as some flawless, two-dimensional superhero.
Not at all.
The text doesn't hide his massive flaws. In fact, it uses his most monumental failure to explain the very geography of their future hope. And this leads us into the deeply complex narrative of chapters 21 and 22.
This is arguably one of the most sophisticated and beautiful theological sections of the entire book.
So here's the setup. David decides to conduct a military census. He orders his commander, Joab, to go throughout all the tribes and count the fighting men. He wants to measure his power.
A very kingly thing to do, but
Right, but the text presents this not as a routine administrative task, but as a massive spiritual failure, a profound sin of pride and self-reliance. And it brings a devastating divine judgment upon the nation in the form of a plague that kills 70,000 people.
the anthropology of Chronicles is very clear here, and it's very different from modern Western individualism. Humans are covenantally and corporately accountable.
The group suffers together.
Yes. A leader's private hubris, his desire to trust in the statistics of his army rather than the invisible protection of God, has catastrophic communal consequences. The sheep suffer for the arrogance of the shepherd.
But before we get to how David stops the plague, I have to zero in on a major interpretive contradiction that the survey addresses, and it's one that completely trips people up.
The census incitement issue.
Yes. If you read the parallel account of this exact event in the older book of 2 Samuel chapter 24, it explicitly says that God was angry with Israel, and so God incited David to take the census. But here, in 1 Chronicles 21.1, it explicitly says, "Then Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel."
It's a stark difference.
Who is pulling the strings here? How do scholars reconcile this?
It's one of the classic textual issues that scholars grapple with. The best way to understand it, and how Velazquez navigates it in the survey, is that we are looking at the development of theological reflection over time.
Okay.
2 Samuel was written earlier, and his primary theological concern was asserting God's absolute unrivaled sovereignty over everything, even judgment. But by the time of the post-exilic chronicler, there is a desire to provide a more nuanced theological mechanism to explain how evil and temptation operate without directly attributing the incitement of sin to a holy God.
So they introduce a secondary agent.
Yes. Chronicles introduces the proximate or immediate demonic agent. The word is Satan, which simply means the adversary. It doesn't deny the overarching mysterious framework of God's providential judgment that 2 Samuel highlights, but it clarifies the direct agency of temptation.
I see.
The adversary steps into David's pride and pushes him over the edge.
It's adding higher resolution to the picture, showing the mechanics behind the scenes of human failing. But while the source of the incitement is a fascinating academic debate, The real emotional core of this story is what happens after the sin and the judgment.
The resolution is everything here.
Right. The plague is sweeping through the land. The destroying angel is visible. David is absolutely terrified. And to his credit, he doesn't make excuses. He takes full responsibility.
He repents deeply.
He is deeply repentant. And the angel of judgment is finally halted at a very specific physical geographical location, the threshing floor of a Jebusite man named Ornan.
Let's look at the imagery of a threshing floor, because it's vital. In the ancient world, a threshing floor was usually an elevated piece of flat rock exposed to the wind.
Okay, an open high space.
Right. It was where you crushed the harvested grain and threw it into the air so the wind would blow away the useless chaff, leaving only the heavy, nourishing wheat to fall to the floor. It is a profound natural metaphor for judgment, separating the good from the bad.
Wow, that's incredibly poetic.
It is highly fitting that the angel of judgment stops here, of all places.
And David doesn't just sit there and cry about his sin. His repentance moves toward tangible action.
That is the key difference between remorse and repentance. Remorse is just feeling bad about the consequences, but repentance moves toward tangible atonement.
Right, doing something to repair the breach.
Exactly. David approaches Ornan and insists on purchasing the threshing floor at full price. He builds an altar there, and he offers costly sacrifices to God. And God answers spectacularly, sending fire down from heaven to consume the sacrifice, signaling that the atonement is accepted and the wrath is satisfied.
And here is the punchline that the chronicler is driving at. This specific spot, this rocky threshing floor where the plague stopped and the fire fell, becomes the exact designated location where the future Temple of Solomon will be built, Mount Moriah.
It is a stunning piece of theological topography. Think about what the chronicler is showing the exiles. They are looking at the ruins of that temple, wondering if God can ever dwell with them again.
Because they feel so much shame.
Exactly. And the chronicler reminds them, the very foundation of our temple, the center of our worship, the place where heaven and earth intersect, was not built on a site of human perfection.
No, not at all.
It was built on the exact spot where divine mercy intercepted and transformed a moment of terrifying divine judgment. The sacred space is literally defined by mercy triumphing over human failure.
That honestly gives me chills. For the post-exilic community reading this, a community that feels in their bones like they are living in the bitter aftermath of God's judgment from the exile.
Yeah, they know judgment intimately.
Knowing that the temple itself originated as a monument to God's mercy must have been incredibly healing.
It teaches them that sin is devastatingly serious. Yes, the exile was real. But failure and judgment are not the end of the narrative. Genuine repentance opens the door to restored service, and God can build his future on the very site of your greatest failure.
So David now knows exactly where the future temple needs to be built. But he also knows, from the covenant promise back in chapter 17, that he is not the one permitted to actually build it.
Right. That task is for his son.
So what does he do? He spends the entire rest of his life obsessively preparing for it. And this massive organizational effort covers the final section of the book, chapters 23 through 29.
It is an overwhelming administrative push. He gathers immense stockpiles of cedar, bronze, iron, and gold. But more importantly than the building materials, he organizes the human personnel.
He ensures that the vision he started can survive his own death. He meticulously sets up the divisions of the Levites. He organizes the priests under the leadership of Zadok. He assigns thousands of musicians, gatekeepers, and civic officers.
It's a huge bureaucratic effort.
It is. As I read this section, it completely reminded me of the life cycle of a visionary startup company.
Oh, how so?
You have the charismatic founder who has the explosive big idea, rallies the early team, captures the market, and secures the initial funding.
That's David in his early years.
Right. But eventually, if that founder is wise, they realize, if this company is going to survive my departure and become a multi-generational legacy institution, I can't just run it on my personal charm anymore.
You'd systems in place.
Exactly. I need to step back, bring in a brilliant COO, and set up an HR department, a payroll system, standardized operating procedures, and a crystal clear org chart. Charisma might spark the kingdom into existence, but rigid institutions are what actually sustain it over time.
That is a very apt modern equivalent. What the text is doing here is giving us a robust ecclesiology, the theology of how the gathered community must be structured and ordered.
Okay, ecclesiology.
Yeah. And what's crucial for modern readers to grasp is that this institutional ordering is not seen by the chronicler as dry, bureaucratic, or lifeless. It is viewed as deeply spiritual.
Explain that, because we usually view structure and spirit as opposites, right? Like structure kills the vibe.
Exactly, that's a very modern prejudice. The survey points out the pneumatology here, which is the doctrine of the Holy Spirit's operation. The Spirit empowers this ordered ministry.
How so?
Well, for example, when David appoints the musicians in chapter 25, the text explicitly says they are appointed for prophesying with lyres, harps, and cymbals.
So the music isn't just background noise.
No, the liturgy and the music are viewed as a vehicle for prophetic revelation. The structure doesn't stifle the Spirit. The structure is the vessel that contains and directs the Spirit's power safely.
So the musicians are essentially leading the congregation in remembering who God is, which is a prophetic act.
Exactly. For the post-exilic readers living in the Persian period, and frankly for us today, the lesson is that long-term survival requires intergenerational continuity.
You need the next generation to carry the baton.
You cannot survive generation after generation on the fumes of spontaneous charisma alone. Charismatic leaders die, feelings fade. You need the Levites. You need the gatekeepers guarding the boundary.
Right, the structures.
You need the established liturgy to remind you of who you are when you forget. Institutional memory is a matter of life and death for an exiled community.
And the book ends with this incredibly moving scene. David publicly charges his young son, Solomon, to take up the mantle and actually build the structure. David leads by example, giving an astronomical amount of his own personal wealth to the project.
He sets the standard.
He does, and this inspires the tribal leaders to give willingly, and the whole community rejoices. The narrative ends in this massive cathartic outpouring of joyful giving, prayer, and praise.
It's a beautiful picture of a community that has transcended its internal divisions and unified around a shared transcendent purpose deeply rooted in their covenant identity.
Now, we have spent a lot of time exploring this beautifully structured, deeply theological history. It's moving, it's psychologically coherent, and it offers incredible lessons. But for a modern reader, it begs a very sharp question.
Did any of this actually happen?
Exactly. Is any of this actually rooted in historical reality? Or did the chronicler just invent a beautifully crafted mythological golden age to make a sad, defeated community feel better about themselves?
It's the big elephant in the room.
Let's step out of the theology for a minute and look at the dirt. Let's look at the archaeological reality that the survey provides.
It's an essential pivot, because the chronicler isn't just writing an allegory. The fundamental claim of biblical faith is that God acts in real, tangible historical time.
Right. History matters.
And the source material from the Biblical Archaeology Society that Velazquez includes gives us a fascinating look at the hard evidence.
I want to highlight two specific pieces of data from the survey that really ground this text. First, the Tel Dan inscription. Set the stage for us. Why was this such a big deal when it was found?
Well, to understand its impact, you have to look at the academic climate before its discovery. In the 1980s and early 90s, there was a vocal movement in academia known as the biblical minimalists.
What do they believe?
They essentially argued that the entire empire of David and Solomon was a later fiction. Because there was no extra-biblical archaeological evidence bearing David's name at that point, they claimed King David was essentially the Israelite equivalent of King Arthur.
Still legend.
Yeah, a mythic hero invented to boost national pride, but possessing zero historical reality.
Wow. So they were saying the core of the chronicler's history was just entirely made up.
Yes, fabricated out of whole cloth. But then in 1993, an archaeological team led by Abraham Biren was excavating at Tel Dan in northern Israel. And they found fragments of a shattered basalt stone monument, a stela dating back to the 9th or 8th century BCE.
Okay, pretty old.
Very old. It was written in Aramaic. And on this stone, an Aramean king, likely Hazael, is boasting about his military victories over Israel. And in line 9 of the inscription, he explicitly boasts about killing a king from the house of David.
The House of David, the exact phrase used to describe the dynasty.
It was an absolute paradigm shift in biblical archaeology. This was concrete, extra-biblical, hostile evidence.
Hostile meaning it wasn't written by an Israelite trying to make themselves look good.
Exactly. This wasn't an Israelite author hyping up their own king. This was an enemy king confirming that a historical, recognized political entity known as the House of David existed and was well known in the ancient Near East. It completely obliterated the minimalist claim that David was purely a myth.
It proves that the chronicler was working with real historical memories of a genuine dynasty. And the second piece of evidence the survey brings up relates to the text itself, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically a manuscript known as 4Q118.
Right, the Qumran discoveries. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in the mid-20th century revolutionized our understanding of how the biblical text was transmitted over centuries.
Because they found all these ancient jars in the caves.
Yes, Qumran Cave 4 contained thousands of fragments. Finding 4Q118, which is a fragment of the Book of Chronicles dating to the late Hellenistic or early Roman period, roughly the 2nd or 1st century BCE, is highly significant.
What does a tiny fragment of manuscript actually tell us, though?
Well, it confirms the textual stability of the book. It shows that 1 Chronicles wasn't just a fringe text. It circulated and was copied as authoritative scripture among Jewish communities long before the Common Era.
So bringing this all together, what's the bottom line here? Does finding a stela and a scroll fragment mean archaeology proves every single claim in the Book of Chronicles?
No, we always have to be intellectually honest about the limits and powers of archaeology. The evidence doesn't prove every single narrative detail.
We aren't going to find David's census ledger.
Exactly. Digging in the dirt won't verify if David actually had exactly 1.5 million men in his census, nor will we ever find a real estate receipt for Ornan's threshing floor.
Right.
But what archaeology does accomplish is that it makes the chronicler's world historically intelligible. The material culture, the geopolitical realities of the Iron Age and Persian periods, the undeniable historical existence of the Davidic dynasty, it all perfectly aligns with the broader historical horizon that 1 Chronicles presupposes.
It fits the world.
The text is reflecting a real, grounded memory world, not a fabricated fantasy.
It anchors the lofty theology in the actual messy dirt of human history, which, if you think about it, is exactly where the chronicler claims God interacts with us. Not in the clouds, but in the dirt of our historical reality.
That is the perfect synthesis. Theology must inhabit history to have any real power.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today, and we've gone incredibly deep into a book most people just skip right over. Let's synthesize this journey.
Yeah, let's tie it all together.
We started with the premise that First Chronicles is not an autopsy of a dead nation, but a survival manual for a post-collapse society trying to rebuild from the rubble of exile. We saw how those massive, seemingly boring lists of names actually functioned as the community's DNA, proving that their identity wasn't lost and reminding them through Jabez that individual cries for help are still heard.
The phone book was actually their lifeline.
Exactly. We learned harsh lessons in the anatomy of leadership, contrasting Saul's charismatic but tragic failure to seek God with David's covenant fidelity and unified support. We explored the dangerous, almost radioactive beauty of God's holiness with the Ark of the Covenant, realizing that enthusiasm without authorized order is disastrous.
Uzzah was a hard lesson to learn.
For sure. We saw the absolute theological epicenter of the book in God's unilateral promise to build David an eternal house, a promise that sustained an exiled people with no king and created the trajectory for the messianic hope. We witnessed the staggering mechanics of divine mercy, watching David's monumental failure at the census transform a threshing floor of judgment into the very foundation of the future temple.
Mercy over judgment.
And finally, we saw the absolute necessity of institutional faithfulness, the brilliant ecclesiology of turning a charismatic vision into a sustained intergenerational reality.
The startup bees and HR department.
You got it. For you listening, I want you to think about the intense contemporary relevance of all of this. We currently live in a modern culture that is totally obsessed with self-invention. We are told constantly that we have to create our own identities from scratch, which is frankly exhausting.
It is a heavy burden.
And simultaneously, we are deeply cynical about institutions, preferring the spark of momentary charisma or the cult of personality. But 1 Chronicles offers a radical, ancient alternative to our modern anxieties. It insists that true, secure identity is received from a historical lineage, not invented on the fly. It demands that power, no matter how talented the leader, must be strictly accountable to a higher moral authority. And it warns us that communities will inevitably collapse when they forget their founding commitments and abandon the boring but necessary institutions that actually sustain them.
It is a profound corrective. The book is an anchor for anyone feeling adrift in a chaotic cultural moment.
It really is. Now, to wrap up our deep dive today, I want to hand it over for one final lingering concept to take with us.
If there is one overarching genius to the chronicler, it is that they absolutely refuse to let the catastrophe of the exile have the final word. They didn't write an autopsy. They took the raw materials of their history and used them to write a promissory note for the future. They looked at the rubble of Jerusalem and dared to say, God's promises are still active and we can rebuild.
I love that.
So the question for you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your week is this. In your own life, when you were facing a personal exile, a major career failure, a relational collapse, or just the feeling that your plans have burned to the ground, what are the foundational genealogies and core memories of faithfulness that you can rely on to anchor your identity? And looking at David at the threshing floor, are you organizing your life in a way that actively turns your past judgments and failures into future spaces of mercy and worship?
What a phenomenal question to walk away with. An X-ray might show you exactly where the bone is broken, but First Chronicles shows you the mechanics of how the bone heals, stronger than before. Thank you so much for joining us on this extensive deep dive into 1 Chronicles. Keep seeking, keep rebuilding the rubble in your own life, and we will see you next time.